The longest river on Earth doesn't actually have a confirmed source. That's not a historical footnote, it's an open scientific question. The Nile stretches more than 6,600 kilometers across northeastern Africa, and yet the precise point where it begins has been disputed for centuries, survived the expeditions of Burton, Speke, and Livingstone, and remains technically unresolved in academic literature today. That contradiction, a river this famous, this studied, this central to human history, and we still can't agree on where it starts, tells you everything about what the Nile actually is. It isn't just a river. It's a system too complex, too vast, and too layered to reduce to a single origin point or a single story. Pharaohs built their entire economic model on its annual flooding cycle.
Priests operating structures called Nilometers held a monopoly on water-level data, and from that data flowed decisions about taxation, grain prices, and who would eat during a dry year. Information about the river was political power, raw, absolute power. That logic hasn't entirely disappeared. Today, 80,000 crocodiles are confined inside Lake Nasser, the artificial reservoir created by the Aswan High Dam, a population density with no natural precedent and consequences that researchers are still calculating. The Nile also turns red periodically, for reasons that range from algal blooms to sediment to something the ancient Egyptians had no framework to explain and simply called a plague. UNESCO once dismantled the Temple of Ramesses II into 1,036 individual blocks and rebuilt it 65 meters uphill to save it from rising reservoir waters. One of the most expensive rescue operations in archaeological history.
And off the Egyptian coast, under Mediterranean water, the port city of Heracleion sat undisturbed for over 1,000 years before divers found it in 2000, intact and enormous. 13 mysteries, each one darker than the last. Stay with it. The source of the world's longest river is a swamp. Not a thundering waterfall, not a mountain glacier, not even a proper lake shore, a quiet, marshy patch of ground in the hills of Rwanda where the water barely moves. That mismatch between one of history's most consequential rivers and the near invisibility of its beginning kept explorers, scientists, and empires guessing for thousands of years. This is number 13 on our list. The ancient Egyptians declared the source of the Nile sacred and unreachable, a place where the gods themselves controlled the heavenly gates.
In the 2nd century AD, the Greek geographer Ptolemy sketched mythical mountains of the moon somewhere deep in the African interior as his best guess, and that guess, embedded in his maps, remained the primary reference for explorers for nearly 1,500 years. Educated Europeans were still navigating by a fantasy. By the mid-19th century, the race to find the source turned into something close to a blood sport. In 1858, Richard Burton and John Hanning Speke reached Lake Tanganyika together, but immediately fell into bitter disagreement. Burton believed Tanganyika fed the Nile. Speke pushed north alone, found a vast lake he named Victoria, and declared the question settled. It was not. Their public feud became one of the defining scandals of the era. A formal debate was scheduled to resolve it. Speke died the day before, under circumstances that were never conclusively explained.
David Livingstone spent the rest of his life searching for the answer and died in Africa in 1873 without finding it. Modern geography has identified the Kagera River and its headwaters in Rwanda and Burundi as the most distant source, feeding into the White Nile. But here is the paradox that science has not fully resolved. The Blue Nile, originating in Ethiopia, contributes roughly 85% of the water that actually reaches Egypt. Whether the true source is the geographically farthest point or the hydraulically dominant tributary remains an open academic debate. The Nile's origin is not a single fact. It is a question that depends on which definition you choose. That's 13. Coming up,
how the ancient Egyptians turned the annual rise of this same river into the foundation of absolute power. Egypt collected its taxes before the harvest existed, not after the grain was weighed, not after the fields were surveyed, before a single seed had pushed through the soil.
That was possible because of the Nile, and more precisely, because of the structures built to read it, the Nilometers, number 12 on our list, and arguably the most consequential measuring instruments in the ancient world. Nilometers were vertical shafts and graduated columns cut into the riverbanks and island rock of the Nile. Egyptian priests and officials used them for millennia to track the annual flood. The most significant examples stood on Rhoda Island in Cairo and on Elephantine Island near Aswan, the latter believed to have been in use as far back as the Old Kingdom. In design, a nilometer could take the form of a graduated marble column set at the center of a circular basin fed by underground channels connecting directly to the river. Or it could be a descending stairwell disappearing below the waterline with notches cut into the walls recording each shift in level. The logic of power here was absolute. A flood too low meant drought, crop failure, and famine. A flood too high destroyed the irrigation networks that made agriculture possible. The ideal inundation, historically recorded at around 16 cubits on the Alexandrian scale, guaranteed a productive season. Priests took the readings, interpreted them, and announced the forecast to the pharaoh and the population. That forecast became the basis for the state's tax assessment on the harvest, calculated before the crop was planted. Higher water, higher rate. The person who held the Nilometer data held the economy of Egypt in their hands. How much grain the state would extract, when scarcity would arrive, who would have access to reserves. When Arab caliphs took Egypt in the 7th century CE, they did not dismantle the Nilometers. They inherited them, extended them, and kept them operational, because they understood what every Egyptian ruler before them had understood. To manage the river was to manage the country.
The Rhoda Island Nilometer, which survives today in reconstructed form, makes that continuity visible. Its octagonal column descends through layers of still water into the cool shadow of the stone basin below, while Arabic inscriptions share the same surface as older incised marks, different eras arguing over the right to measure the same river. The Nile was never simply water. It was the currency on which a civilization ran. Number 11. Meroe, Sudan. Stand at the edge of the Sudanese desert and look north. What rises from the sand is not what you expect. These are not the broad, monumental silhouettes of Giza. These are needles, steep, narrow, almost aggressive in their geometry. More than 200 of them, clustered so tightly they seem to crowd each other for space on the horizon. This is the royal necropolis of Meroe, the capital of Kush, and it belongs to a civilization that most of the world has never properly met. Kush spent centuries in Egypt's shadow.
Then it conquered Egypt. In the 7th century BC, Kushite pharaohs, the 25th dynasty, whom the Greeks and Egyptians called the Black Pharaohs, ruled the entire Nile Valley from the heart of modern Sudan all the way to the Mediterranean. Kings like Taharqa did not tear down what they found. They restored temples, revived forgotten cults, and worshipped Amun with a devotion that Egypt itself had begun to lose. They were not invaders erasing a culture, they were custodians preserving one. The Meroitic civilization endured for roughly 1,000 years. Its people developed their own alphabet, a writing system that modern scholars have only partially cracked. The sounds of the letters are known, the meaning of most texts is not. An entire empire is speaking to us from the walls of its monuments, and we cannot fully understand what it is saying. What we can see is extraordinary. The pyramids here sit on small funerary chapels, their surfaces carved with reliefs. The angle of inclination is far steeper than anything the Egyptians built. Each structure looks tensed, compressed, like it was built in a hurry or built to last. Some of that profile is now gone. In the 19th century, an Italian adventurer named Giuseppe Ferlini dismantled the tops of roughly 40 of these pyramids, searching for gold inside. He found some. The monuments did not recover. Meroe sits around 200 kilometers north of Khartoum, far from established tourist routes. UNESCO has designated it a World Heritage Site, but erosion and chronic underfunding continue to threaten the site. The silence here is not peaceful. It is the silence of something that should be better known, better protected, and better understood. A civilization that outlasted empires, written in a script we still cannot read, standing in a desert most travelers never reach. That is Meroe.
Twice a year, on February 22nd and October 22nd, the rising sun reaches deep into a temple carved from solid rock and illuminates the same statues it was designed to illuminate over 3,000 years ago. And that temple is not where it originally stood. Abu Simbel was moved. The entire complex, commissioned by Ramesses II, was cut apart, lifted 65 meters, and reassembled piece by piece to save it from a reservoir that didn't yet exist. When Egypt began construction of the Aswan High Dam in 1964, the math was unforgiving. The rising waters of Lake Nasser would permanently submerge 4 20-meter stone colossi and the temple behind them. UNESCO's response was to attempt something with no historical precedent. 50 nations contributed funding.
Engineers and archaeologists spent 8 years planning and executing a relocation that required cutting the rock-hewn temple into 1,036 individual blocks, some weighing up to 20 tons, transporting them and reconstructing the entire structure on higher ground. To preserve the illusion of a solid cliff face, an artificial hill was built from scratch around a concrete dome. Because the temple was never freestanding to begin with, it was always part of the rock itself. What makes the operation remarkable is not just its scale, but its accuracy. The solar alignment, that twice-yearly illumination of the inner sanctuary, was successfully reproduced at the new site. And one statue, Ptah, god of the underworld, remains in permanent shadow, just as the original design intended. That detail survived 3,000 years, a complete structural dismantlement and a 65-meter relocation, accurate to within a single degree. Abu Simbel ranks 10th among humanity's greatest acts of cultural preservation. The lake that nearly erased it now holds one more unexpected record of its own: the world's largest concentration of Nile crocodiles. Number 9. A city did not burn, was not conquered, was not abandoned to desert winds. It simply sank. Heracleion, once celebrated by Herodotus as one of the greatest ports in the ancient world, slipped beneath the surface of the Mediterranean and vanished so completely that for centuries scholars debated whether it had ever truly existed. It had. And in 2001, French underwater archaeologist Frank Godillot proved it, locating the submerged city approximately 10 meters below the sea floor, several kilometers from the modern Egyptian coastline. In antiquity, Heracleion, known to Egyptians as Thonis, stood at the mouth of the Nile where the river meets the sea. And that geography made it indispensable. Trading vessels from Greece and Phoenicia docked at its wharves. A grand temple to Amun dominated its skyline. Legend held that Hercules himself had first set foot on Egyptian soil right here. Classical writers described a city teeming with merchants, priests and sailors, a living intersection of Mediterranean civilizations. Then the ground gave way. The explanation lies in a geological process called liquefaction. The Nile Delta is built from loose, waterlogged alluvial sediments, material that behaves like solid ground under normal conditions, but loses all structural integrity during seismic stress or sudden shifts in load. When that happens, the ground stops being ground. It becomes something closer to quicksand, and anything resting on it begins to sink. That is what happened to Heracleion, most likely across the 7th century CE. Entire city blocks, colonnades, multi-ton statues, harbour infrastructure, all of it descending slowly and irreversibly into the delta mud. The people living there did not experience a single catastrophic night. They watched their city disappear over years, perhaps decades. What Godio's team found preserved beneath the silt was remarkable. Colossal statues, gold jewellery, hundreds of bronze anchors, coins, and bilingual temple stelae. Complete darkness and zero oxygen had acted as a perfect preservative for 1,500 years. Heracleion is a reminder that the Nile Delta is not stable ground, but a slow negotiation between land and water, and sometimes the water wins. If an entire port city can vanish without fire or conquest, the question becomes unavoidable. What else lies hidden beneath these waters? The Nile's dangers do not always come from below. Sometimes they rise straight to the surface, and they turn the river red. A river turning blood red sounds like mythology. On the Nile, it's chemistry, and that makes it no less terrifying. What ancient texts described as divine punishment is now understood as a toxic algal bloom, a rapid, explosive multiplication of microalgae and cyanobacteria that can transform hundreds of kilometers of living river into a dead zone within days. This is one of the most destructive ecological events the Nile faces, and it is happening more often. The trigger is a precise combination of factors. Agricultural runoff carries phosphorus and nitrogen from surrounding fields into the water. When temperatures rise and the current slows, conditions that climate shifts are making more frequent, those nutrients feed microbial colonies that double and redouble at staggering speed. The organisms form a dense mat across the surface, cutting off sunlight to everything below. Aquatic plants die, oxygen levels plummet, fish suffocate and rise to the surface by the thousands, a slow, silent mass mortality along the riverbanks. Some cyanobacterial species add a second layer of danger. They release neurotoxins and hepatotoxins into the water. For livestock drinking from the river, exposure is often fatal. For people relying on irrigation channels fed by the Nile, the threat reaches directly into their fields and water supplies. Fishing communities lose their livelihood overnight. The sensory reality of it is striking. A wide river the color of rust, motionless fish at the shore, the thick smell of decay hanging in the air for days. Scientists tracking the Nile rank this as a recurring systemic threat, not a rare anomaly. Warming temperatures and disrupted hydrological cycles have increased both the frequency and the scale of these events. Rated 8 on our Index of Extreme Natural Phenomena, the Nile's red tide is a slow-moving catastrophe built from fertilizer, heat, and climate change. Invisible at the source, devastating at the waterline. And beneath that contaminated surface, the river holds another kind of secret. The submerged ruins of Heracleion, hidden for centuries. A temple was dismantled and rebuilt, stone by stone, to save it from the river that had made it sacred. That is the central paradox of Philae, and it is entirely true. For nearly 70 years, the Temple of Isis on Philae Island existed in a state of slow drowning. After the British colonial administration completed the first Aswan Dam in 1902, the island began to sink beneath the Nile for months at a time. Engineers raised the dam twice more, in 1907 and 1912, deepening the flood each cycle. Pilgrims still came, rowing out in small boats to peer through greenish water at submerged hypostyle halls. The carvings softened, the pigments vanished, the limestone mortar dissolved. It was, depending on your perspective, either the most haunting sight in Egypt or an ongoing act of cultural destruction. Philae had earned that devotion over 3 millennia. The island sits a few kilometers south of Aswan, where granite cliffs press the Nile into a narrow channel, and the water turns a particular shade of translucent green. Ancient Egyptians believed this was where the body of Osiris rested and where Isis mourned him on the bank, the threshold of the afterlife. Construction of the temple complex began under Nectanebo I and continued through successive dynasties all the way into the Roman period, each era adding its own layer to a site already dense with meaning. When the High Aswan Dam project in the 1970s made it clear that Philae would be permanently submerged, UNESCO responded with an engineering operation that matched the ambition of the original builders. 3,000 steel pilings were driven into the riverbed around the island, the enclosed area was pumped dry, and 40,000 numbered stone blocks were carefully dismantled. The blocks were ferried to the neighbouring island of Agilkia, which had been reshaped to approximate the footprint of the original Philae. Reassembly was completed in 1980, ranking the project among the most complex heritage rescues ever undertaken, 7th on the list of great preservation operations. Saving the sacred, though, is only one side of humanity's relationship with the Nile. The river also keeps secrets of its own, buried beneath water no one thought to look beneath. Tens of thousands of crocodiles were killed, wrapped in linen, and stacked floor to ceiling in underground galleries, not as victims of a purge, but as offerings to a god. That is what the crocodile mummy necropolises of ancient Tunis and sites like Kom el Bregar in the limestone hills west of the Nile actually represent. And the scale of it only became clear once X-ray analysis entered the picture. To understand why, you have to start with Sobek. In Egyptian religious thought, the Nile crocodile was not merely dangerous, it was sacred. Sobek was lord of water, of the annual flood that fertilized Egypt's fields, and of royal power itself. A creature capable of pulling a human being into the depths was, by that logic, a living conduit to the divine. In the city of Shedet, which the Greeks renamed Crocodilopolis, individual sacred crocodiles were kept alive, fed ritual meals, fitted with gold earrings, and buried with ceremony upon their death. That was one form of the cult, but the votive industry was something else entirely. Small crocodiles and their eggs were deliberately raised, killed young, and mummified in industrial quantities. Pilgrims purchased these wrapped bundles and deposited them at temples of Sobek as religious offerings. Radiological scans of surviving mummies have confirmed what the sheer numbers suggested. Many animals were slaughtered before reaching maturity, purpose-bred for sacrifice. Some mummies contain eggs, others contain hatchlings arranged inside adult bodies. The physical spaces where these mummies were stored are unsettling in a way photographs rarely capture. Low limestone ceilings, absolute darkness held for millennia, and stacked silhouettes everywhere. Elongated forms wound in darkened bandages, the serrated outline of a jaw just visible through the wrapping. Rating 6 on our list, this is a site where industrial logic and religious devotion operated as a single system. The dead crocodile was an object of worship. What the living crocodile in the waters of Lake Nasser represents today is something else, a threat that no amount of ritual preparation has ever made manageable. One fish destroyed more species than most natural disasters in recorded history. The Nile perch was introduced into Lake Victoria in the 1950s by British colonial authorities with a stated purpose that seemed reasonable at the time: boost industrial fishing and address food insecurity across East Africa. What followed became a textbook case of ecological collapse. Before the perch arrived, Lake Victoria held more than 500 species of cichlid fish, every one of them found nowhere else on Earth. These species had co-evolved over millions of years, each filling a precise niche in a system that was delicate but remarkably stable. The Nile perch, Lates niloticus, brought none of that stability with it. Growing up to 2 meters long and weighing as much as 200 kilograms, it entered a lake that had no predators equipped to stop it. Over the following decades, it wiped out more than 200 endemic cichlid species. Most of them vanished before researchers had any chance to formally document them.
Scientists classify this as one of the largest recorded vertebrate extinction events in observational history. The destruction did not stop at the water's edge. Nile perch is an oily fish. It cannot be preserved by simple sun-drying. Smoking became the only viable method, and that required fuel. Shoreline forests were stripped. Deforestation triggered severe bank erosion, and runoff carrying agricultural fertilizers flooded the lake with nutrients. Algal blooms followed, oxygen levels fell, and a body of water that had sustained human populations for thousands of years began to suffocate. Today, Lake Victoria's surface is clouded and greenish, partially choked by water hyacinth, itself an accidental introduction. Empty nets, treeless banks. Ecological impact rating, 5 out of 5. The Nile perch is not just a conservation story. It is a precise illustration of how quickly a single decision, made with confidence and good intentions, can dismantle a living system that took millions of years to build. The greatest military force the ancient world ever assembled was stopped by rocks and water. Not by an army, not by a fortress, by 6 points in a river where granite breaks the surface and turns the Nile into something ungovernable. These are the cataracts, and for thousands of years they decided where the known world ended. There are 6 of them strung between modern Egypt and Sudan. The first sits at Aswan, where ancient Egypt placed its southern edge. The 6th reaches deep into Nubian territory, near Khartoum. Between them, the river is not a road, it is an obstacle. The bed of ancient granite heaves upward in each of these stretches, shattering the current into rapids, whirlpools, and white water that no loaded vessel could survive. This is why Emperor Augustus's expedition halted at the second cataract and went no further. The logistics of empire simply could not cross what the river refused to allow. Traders who moved gold, ivory, and enslaved people out of the African interior understood the problem in practical terms. At each cataract, boats had to be hauled out of the water and dragged over land, sometimes for several kilometers across burning sand, until the river calmed again. That portage demanded hundreds of carriers, months of additional travel, and costs that made every transaction downstream more expensive. Control the bank at a cataract, and you controlled everything that moved along the river. The Nubian kingdoms understood this. So did the Egyptian pharaohs, who treated the first cataract as a sacred threshold, the boundary where their world gave way to the unknown. Engineers of the 20th century solved the problem differently. The Aswan High Dam flooded most of the cataracts beneath Lake Nasser's still enormous waters. The chaos of granite and current became reservoir, but the dam's reach was not total, and where it fell short, the old sound remains. Water breaking against stone, the same noise that turned back Rome. The Nile loses more than half of itself before it ever reaches Egypt. Not to drought, not to irrigation, not to human consumption, but to a swamp. Number 3 on our list is the Sud, a vast wetland in South Sudan, and it may be the most consequential body of water most people have never heard of. At peak flood, the Sud spreads across 130,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of Greece. In the dry season it pulls back, but it never vanishes. What remains is something that defies easy categorization. Not solid ground, not open water, but a slow-moving maze of floating islands built from papyrus, reeds, and rotting vegetation. These islands drift. They converge and separate on no predictable schedule. A channel open yesterday may be sealed shut today. The paradox is total. The Sud is part of the Nile, fed by it, shaped by it.
and yet the Sud is where the Nile comes to disappear. The White Nile enters this wetland as a substantial river. What exits on the other side is a fraction of that volume. The swamp evaporates water on a scale that reshapes the hydrology of an entire continent. Every nation downstream, Sudan, Egypt, the communities of hundreds of millions of people, receives less water because of what this swamp takes for itself. In the 19th century, European expeditions pushing toward the Nile's source treated the Sud as an obstacle to be crossed. They were wrong to underestimate it. Ships became trapped for weeks in the floating vegetation. Crews died of malaria. Multiple expeditions turned back without completing even a quarter of the crossing.
No desert in Africa stopped explorers as completely as this swamp did. Visually, the Sud offers no landmarks, no edges, no fixed points. The horizon is an unbroken line of green. Birds circle above. Beneath the surface, dark water offers no depth to read. It is a place designed, it seems, to disorient and to consume. What the Nile surrenders here, it never recovers. The most dangerous snake along the Nile is not the one people fear. It is not the Egyptian cobra raised in threat display, hoods spread wide. It is a small, sand-coloured viper that most people would step on before they ever noticed it. The Nile saw-scaled viper, Echis pyramidum, ranks number 2 among the Nile's most dangerous inhabitants, and researchers estimate that snakes of the genus Echis are responsible for more human deaths from snakebite across Africa and the Middle East than any larger, more celebrated predator in the region, including cobras and mambas. The reason begins with scale. An average adult rarely exceeds 60 centimeters in length. Many specimens are no wider than a human hand. Nothing about the animal signals danger in the way people expect danger to look. That expectation is the problem. Echis pyramidum lives precisely where people live. It favors sandy riverbanks, dry scrub, the margins of irrigation canals, fields, and the dirt paths that run between village houses. Its scales reproduce the texture and color of riverbank sand with an accuracy that makes the snake functionally invisible even under direct observation. A barefoot farmer walking to the water before dawn and a child playing in the dust outside a doorway face the same risk. Stepping on the viper before they ever hear its warning. That warning, when it comes, is itself a trap. The saw-scaled viper coils its body into a C-shape and rasps its serrated lateral scales together in a dry metallic hiss that sounds nothing like a snake. It resembles a burning fuse or shifting sand.
People who hear it for the first time do not register it as a threat. If a bite does occur, the hemotoxic venom begins destroying blood vessel walls almost immediately. Without timely antivenin, the result over several days is systemic hemorrhage, tissue necrosis, and organ failure. Access to antivenin across the remote stretches of the Nile Valley has historically been, and remains, severely limited. The danger, in the end, is not exotic. It lies in the sand at the water's edge, warming in the morning sun, exactly where a person would naturally step. Lake Nasser may be the most dangerous stretch of water on Earth, and a dam built to generate electricity is the reason why. When the Aswan High Dam was completed in 1970, engineers flooded nearly 500 kilometers of the Nile Valley, erasing ancient Nubian villages, temples, and burial grounds that had stood for thousands of years. What no one fully anticipated was the ecological consequence. The Nile crocodiles that had once ranged across enormous distances of river were now confined to a single enclosed basin. Warm water, abundant fish, and almost no permanent human settlement. The conditions were, from a crocodile's perspective, perfect. Today, zoologists estimate that roughly 80,000 Nile crocodiles inhabit Lake Nasser, the highest density of this species anywhere on the planet. That number alone is striking, but the size of individual animals pushes the statistic into a different category. Some specimens here exceed 6 meters in length and weigh close to 1,000 kilograms. These are not outliers born from myth. They are documented by researchers and confirmed by the fishermen who share the water with them. The explanation lies in biology. Nile crocodiles never stop growing.
Given sufficient food and the absence of serious threats, decades of uninterrupted growth produce animals of a scale that seems improbable until you see the evidence. The lake's surface gives nothing away. Ochre sand, flat water, silence. A crocodile resting just below the surface leaves no ripple, no shadow, only nostrils and eyes flush with the waterline, and even those are easy to miss. Fishermen who work these waters understand this. They understand it and they go out anyway, because the catch feeds their families. Attacks happen. Precise figures are hard to compile in such a remote area, but the accounts are consistent and researchers do not dismiss them. What the Aswan Dam created, unintentionally, was a sanctuary. A closed system where one of the oldest and most effective predators on the planet found exactly what it needed to thrive on a scale impossible almost anywhere else. This is the #1 most dangerous stretch of the Nile.
The crocodile, however, is not the only creature along these banks whose reputation demands a closer look. Nobody actually knows where the Nile begins. That's not a poetic exaggeration. It's a geographic fact that has divided scientists for over a century and still has no universally accepted answer. And if we can't agree on something as fundamental as a river's source, imagine how much else this civilization-defining waterway is still hiding from us. 13 mysteries. That's what this journey uncovered along the longest river on Earth, and every single one of them forces a rethink of what we thought we knew. Ancient priests turned the act of measuring water into an instrument of absolute imperial control. The Nilometer wasn't a scientific tool, it was a political weapon. The forgotten pharaohs of Kush built pyramids in the Sudanese desert, ruled Egypt, and was systematically erased from the dominant historical narrative for centuries. When the Aswan Reservoir threatened to swallow the temples of Ramesses II and Isis, engineers moved entire stone structures piece by piece to higher ground, a rescue operation that had never been attempted at that scale before. An entire city, Heracleion, sank into the Mediterranean mud and vanished for 1,000 years, only to be rediscovered by divers in the modern era. Underground tombs near Aswan hold thousands of mummified crocodiles. Lake Victoria delivered a brutal lesson in ecological hubris. The Nile's cataracts stopped ancient fleets cold. And somewhere in those reeds, something the size of a human hand can kill just as surely as a 6-meter crocodile whose ancestors watched the pharaohs rise and fall. The reason all of this still surprises us is simple. We keep treating the Nile as a backdrop to human history rather than as a living system with its own logic. If this river moved you, subscribe. There's still more it hasn't told us.